Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but most of the time when someone gets introduced as having a PhD from the London School of Economics, I think this is going to hurt. In fact, I've only ever met one person who knew how to talk to somebody who heads a public policy think tank and has a PhD from the London School of Economics. This happened to me not too long ago. We were doing some renovations at the house. And we had the wallpaper sample book from which we chose the wallpaper we wanted. And I was given the task of taking the book back to the paint store and choosing the paint to go with the wallpaper. So I put the wallpaper sample book on the counter. And I said to the woman, I'm here to pick the paint to go with this wallpaper. She looked me up and down. She said, do you have a note? I said, that's funny. I could have sworn you asked me if I had a note. She said, I did. She said, I can't sell paint to men without a note. This is an absolutely true story, but I'm not making this up. And I noticed at the reaction, I kind of scoped out the audience here to make sure there were enough women to make this laugh. Because my experience of this story is that the women laugh first, and the men think, well, I guess it must be funny. If you don't know why it's funny, go home and ask your wife. It's a delight to be back in PEI. I've spent a lot of time here, and in fact, Minister, I've been to the fish farm you referred to earlier. Probably it was Jerry Johnson who wanted the land next door, right? Jerry Johnson. I wrote one of the letters of recommendation that got Jerry the only Professor Emeritus designation that UPEI has given in the last 5 years. And Jerry and I worked together on a series of policy papers on aquaculture with my previous institute, the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies, and the Canadian Aquaculture Institute at UPEI. I heard Larry Hamill's name mentioned a minute ago. Larry and I worked on that series together, as well as Jerry Johnson and many other people from the vet school at UPEI. So always a pleasure to be here. I know we're a little short on time, so I'm going to skip some of the pleasantries and move right on to talking about Canada as a world food superpower. When in 1965, I'm old enough to remember this, I'm sorry to say, Bob Dylan sang, I ain't going to work on Maggie's farm no more. I see a few people who will remember that. He was echoing a mental picture almost all of us have about conditions on the farm. The dirty 30s largely spawned the identification of farming with grinding poverty, primitive technologies, and capricious commodity prices. But that image has proven durable. In Ottawa, as well as in the popular imagination, farmers and the food industry are old economy. The family farm, a sponge, sucking up major tax dollars to keep a politically powerful rural constituency sweet. But, as a wise man once remarked, it ain't what you know that's the problem. It's what you think you know that just ain't so. And the real position of Canada's food industry couldn't be more different than the outdated vision that still infects too many politicians, civil servants, and opinion leaders. Far from being in decline, the agriculture and food sector is a potential economic powerhouse for Canada. The amount of food that will be consumed in the next 50 years in the world will exceed all the food eaten in the rest of human history. All the food eaten in the rest of human history. World demand is on the upswing, driven by rising population, urbanization, and rising global incomes. Yet the world's doubtful ability to respond to that growing demand is ringing alarm bells all over the world. After half a century in which the Green Revolution produced a huge spurt in food production, that growth is tailing off just when we most need it to keep going. If we do not find ways, as a planet, to rise to this challenge, major food shortages and humanitarian disasters are just a few short years away. As a result, food prices are already rising all over the planet. And those able to feed the world's teeming billions will not only do a service to humanity, but they will make a good living doing it. In agriculture and food, including aquaculture, and I will talk about aquaculture, it will be not only possible, but imperative to do good by doing well. How does Canada fit in? We have everything we need to fill a major share of the gap that is emerging in the world's food supply. We have vast tracts of agricultural land. Our soil is in much better shape than in many other food-producing nations. Our climate is clement, and climate change is likely to make it even more so. Our supply of fresh water, a major constraint on other farming powers, is the envy of the world. And we have clever, educated, and experienced people in every part of the sector. Farmers, technologists, researchers, managers, manufacturers, and more. And yet, despite the scale and the scope of the opportunity, Canada is not merely failing to take advantage of these propitious circumstances. Our ability to supply world markets is declining, and our productivity on the farm is falling far behind that of our peers such as the United States and Australia. Now, that all adds up to a pretty grand strategic vision of the agriculture and food industry both globally and here in Canada, and a grand vision of the problems that we have to overcome if we are to realize our potential. Now, I want to take a few moments and put some flesh on the bones of these various claims I've made about the world that we are going to inhabit and Canada's place in it from the point of view of food. At the beginning of the 20th century, roughly 90% of Canadians lived in rural Canada. 90% of Canadians lived in rural Canada. The rest in cities. By the end of the last century, the proportions had essentially reversed. Our forebears didn't just move for the bright lights. They moved chiefly because life in the city made them and their children better off. On the farm, people have to be more self-sufficient, do a little bit of a lot of things. In the city, there were more kinds of jobs, services, goods, education, so more room for specialization. And that shift from the countryside to the city was probably the single biggest factor behind the vast increase in the standard of living that we have enjoyed compared to our great-grandparents. I'm a living example of that. My family arrived from Ireland in the 1820s, settled in southern Ontario, and it was only 2 generations later that my grandfather was the first Crowley to leave the family farm, go off to the University of Toronto and become a dentist. He sent his branch of the family off on a completely different trajectory. The family farm, founded by Lawrence and Honora Crowley, still owned by Crowleys today, 5 generations later. But there are now Crowleys all over Canada, living mostly in cities, doing mostly professional work. Canada's experience is not unique. What is unusual in global terms, however, is how far out in front we and other industrial countries are in that transition to urban living. The rest of the world is working hard to catch up. Of the 7 billion people in the world, only about half of them live in cities. But by 2050, according to the United Nations, the world's population will have increased by 2.3 billion people, whereas the population of the world's cities will have increased by 2.6 billion. So the world's population is going to increase by 2.3 billion, and the population of the world's cities will increase by 2.6 billion. All of the population increase. All of the population increase over the next 40 years will take place in cities. And another 300 million people will move from rural areas to the city. Now, as Paul Romer, one of the world's leading economists, said in a talk he gave recently in Ottawa for my institute, all this means that there is a serious shortage of cities in the world. A serious shortage of cities. He points out that much effort is spent trying to tear down the barriers to trade between countries on the grounds that this will increase the world's wealth by a few percentage points. And don't get me wrong, I'm completely in favor of that. And as you know, Canada has negotiated free trade with the United States. We've concluded free trade agreements with various other countries. We're working on one with Israel. We're talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The whole reason we promote trade between countries is because international trade grows faster than national economies grow. And so if you can get in on trade, you get a faster growth rate than if you're dependent just on your local growth rate. But you pull more people out of poverty faster by simply moving them from the country to the city. Look no further than this for the explanation of the explosive growth. Got to get my little slide controller here. The explosive growth of cities throughout the world, and especially in the developing world. There's a slide of Asia at night. This is where the vast majority of cities, the cities that I've described, the new cities are going to be. I don't know if any of you have the same reaction I do. I often read in the newspapers they're talking about some Chinese city that the journalist has visited and it's got 8 or 10 or 12 million people, and I've never heard of it. I've never heard of it. This is where a lot of the action is going to take place. This rapid urbanization is the chief explanation as to why these societies are able to grow so quickly compared to the West. You've all heard, no doubt, about the tremendous progress that we've made. How many people in the world we have pulled out of absolute poverty over the last 25 or 30 years. And I know that a lot of people think, well, you know, that must be due to economic development or international aid or whatever. No. It's primarily due to the fact that these people move from the countryside to the city. We've already gone through the transition in Canada. They're on the way. Look at how growth is distributed in the world. High growth areas in dark blue. Think about what you know about the growth of cities in those dark blue areas. And if you want to see how closely urbanization and economic progress are linked, look at the places where it's not happening. That is North Korea at night. The only thing you can see is the Kim family compound, presumably lit by candles. The effect of urbanization on workers' incomes in the developing world is absolutely startling. Workers in cities earn a third more than their non-urban counterparts. A large amount of evidence suggests that that premium is not just the result of workers in cities having more ability. It means that cities make people more productive. A significant fraction of the urban wage premium goes to workers over time. In other words, they don't simply move to the city and get that wage premium. Their ability to earn higher wages increases over time, and it stays with them. They stay in the city long enough, their higher wage premium stays with them after they leave the city. So cities speed the accumulation of what the economists call in their ugly language, human capital. If you live in a city for a while, odds are experience will make you a more valuable worker, and you'll be able to take that new value with you. Moreover, this association between living in cities and wage growth seems chiefly due to job changes rather than faster wage growth experienced while on a particular job. The result is consistent with the idea that cities enhance workers' productivity because there are lots of jobs and it's easy to change from one to another. Learning new things about work and learning new things about yourself and what you can do along the way. Through a job search and matching process in cities, people seem to learn about what they do well and employers are most willing to pay for. Not only is urbanization driving rising global prosperity, but rich city dwellers eat differently. They eat differently, and usually better than their rural counterparts. Dollar for dollar, city dwellers eat more food, and especially more processed food, than their country cousins. They also tend to be richer and to be able to afford pricier food, such as meat. Here's a graph showing the global change in consumption patterns for meat. You can see that the blue bar is population growth, and the red bars are meat consumption. You can see that while population is growing quite handsomely, consumption of meat is growing a lot faster. And that is directly related to the move from the countryside to the city. So meat demand is going to rise strongly. I think this is true for all proteins, including fish. In 2000, over half of all the calories consumed in developing countries, over half of all the calories consumed in developing countries were provided by cereals, and only a fifth by meat, dairy, and vegetable oils. By 2050, when the world population hits 9 billion, the FAO, a UN organization that you're probably familiar with, thinks that the contribution of cereals will have dropped to less than half, and that meat, dairy, and fats will have risen to close to a third. To match that soaring demand, meat production will need to increase by 470 million tons by 2050, almost double its current level. Output of soybeans, most of which are fed to animals, will more than double to 515 million tons. So here's a little bit of information about how income and diet are related. In other words, rising global incomes and population will increase demand for food and the composition of the average person's diet, but the entirety of the population increase will take place in cities where these new populations will be unable to supply their own food through their own efforts. Much more food demand will move into the marketplace, and there will be fewer people in the countryside to satisfy that food demand. But nobody knows better than the people in this room that you cannot simply increase the food supply by flipping a switch. It generally requires, at a minimum, land, water, fertilizer, capital, and innovation. There's a story to be told on each one of those topics, but I'm going to have to touch only on a few highlights. Overall, the FAO reckons total demand for food will rise about 70%. Total demand for food will rise by about 70% in the 44 years from 2006 to 2050. More than twice as much as the demand for cereals. So cereals, the demand for cereals is going to increase, but the overall demand for food will rise twice as much. That's still less than half as much as the rise in food production in the 44 years from 1962 to 2006. In other words, food production has already, over the last 40 years or so, grown much faster than it needs to grow over the next 40 years. So some people are of the view that producing enough food to feed the world in the next 4 decades should be easier than it was to increase food production over the last 40 years. After all, we've already shown that we can increase the food supply faster than population growth that we've seen in recent years, and population growth is slowing. We're still going to be facing unbelievably huge increases in population, but the rate of increase is slowing. Alas, however, we are starting to run into the problem of diminishing returns in improving food productivity. It looks more and more likely that increasing food supplies by the 70% that we will need in the next 40 years, the 70% I've already mentioned, may prove harder than it was to raise our food supply by the 150% we managed in the previous 40 years. The main reason is problems with yield. Yield, tons per hectare, bushels per acre, however you like to think about it, is the traditional gauge of agriculture's performance. And the growth in yields has been slowing down. It was about 3% a year for staple crops in the 1960s. It's down to 1% now. It's down to 1%. The Green Revolution was the reason for the extraordinary growth in productivity in earlier decades. By some estimates, farmers in the developing countries could often double their harvest by switching to Green Revolution seeds, many of them developed, as I'm sure a lot of people in this room know, by the legendary plant breeder Norman Borlaug. Now experts think that the best current technologies could perhaps increase yields by a further 50%. That's still a lot, but not as spectacular as the earlier improvements. The low-hanging fruit have been plucked and eaten. Green Revolution threw resources at plant breeding, and it worked brilliantly. The new seeds enabled grains to absorb more fertilizer and water. It allowed them to be packed more densely and still grow successfully. But now there's not a lot more water to spare. Fertilizer usage in some places has already passed the saturation point, so a new Green Revolution will have to make even more efficient use of existing resources rather than assuming that there will be always these new inputs. The next 40 years will also have to deal with the potentially profound damage to farming from climate change, which in some parts of the world could reduce yields by a third. And disturbingly, for the first time since the Green Revolution, crop yields are growing more slowly than population. To be more exact, the growth in the population and demand for food have both slowed down, but crop yields have slowed down more. Between 1961 and 1990, wheat yields were rising at nearly 3% a year. During that time, the world's population grew by an average of 1.8% a year. Between 1990 and 2007, population growth slowed down to 1.4%, but the rise in annual wheat yield slackened to 0.5%. The growth in rice yields between the two periods halved. The yields of mankind's two most important crops are now almost flat. And here is a slide about the world population growth, 75 million additional people to feed every year. And here is a slide about the feed that's needed to produce meat. As you can see, we're talking about 7 to 8 kilos of feed to produce a kilo of meat. And you saw the earlier slides about the rise in meat consumption. You put that together with flat growth in yields, and we've got a problem. And yet the changing patterns of food consumption I mentioned mean less of these grains will be available for direct human consumption, since it will be going to make meat and other proteins like fish. Even with herbivorous species of farmed fish like carp, tilapia, and catfish, it still takes about 2 kilos of feed to produce a kilo of protein. And grains are also being drained away for other purposes, like biofuels. This is the percent of world production used as ethanol feedstock from various grains. You can see that 13% of the world's corn production is going to make fuel. Here's the percentage of the world's production used as biodiesel feedstock. You can see almost half of the canola production is going to make fuel. It's not going to feed anybody. These trends help to explain rising food prices and declining stocks-to-use ratios. And that means that the world food system is more vulnerable to shocks because the buffer stocks are lower. I won't get into a long discussion about the stock-to-use ratio, but essentially you can see the downward trend of these lines, and that indicates that the buffer stocks available to the world in the case of food difficulties or whatever, those buffer stocks are declining. And that downward trend is also a signal of rising prices. We're leaving an era of food surpluses and entering a world of food shortages with massive implications for humanity and for the planet. The solution isn't as easy as, say, bringing more agricultural land into production. The old adage about land, they ain't making any more of it, is not quite true from an agricultural point of view. Several million acres of agricultural land have been cleared in Brazil, for example, in the past 2 decades, and more is available there and elsewhere. Even so, other land is going out of agricultural production in many areas of the world. If I put up for you a slide of world forest cover, you would see that at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot less forest cover than there is today. And that's because marginal farmland has often gone out of production and returned to forest use. So a lot of land is going out of agricultural production in many areas of the world because of urbanization, environmental degradation, declining water tables, and lots of other reasons. The net result is that in absolute terms, total agricultural land is stable, while on a per capita basis, it's declining rapidly. So this is the amount of farmland per person in the world. You can see it's declining very rapidly. Another fact about land is its distribution. The world's arable land is not distributed around the world in the same proportion as its population. The areas of the world with the most people, such as Asia, do not have a commensurate area of arable land. Canada, on the other hand, which has a tiny share of the world's population, has the third largest endowment of arable land per capita in the world, just behind Australia and Kazakhstan. And although Australia has the most arable land per person, the quality of that land is relatively low, largely because of water availability. Australia is quite a dry place. Kazakhstan ranks second in terms of arable land per capita, but it's got almost no infrastructure. You can grow whatever you like there. You can't get it anywhere. Most of Canada's competitors have less than half the arable land per capita available in this country, while our potential customers have even less. We have literally 10 times as much arable land per person as China, for example, and that makes Canada's land base a real strength for the future. And here's a slide showing you in the orange areas places of very degraded soil, and yellow is somewhat degraded soil. You can see that Canada is doing pretty well. Not even healthy soils are evenly distributed around the world. Perhaps most importantly, many of the world's soils have been badly degraded by overuse and climate change. This includes much of Asia and Africa, the areas where demand for food is rapidly increasing. These soils have lost quality, productivity, and utility due to erosion, desertification, and or significant use of chemicals instead of organic matter to try and improve their productivity. You can see on the slide that Canada has suffered less from this than most other countries. Canada has some of the best and most stable soils in the world. Another significant advantage in our efforts to take advantage of global market trends. Canada's use of nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides are lower than some of our competitors and potential customers, and that will help us ensure that soils remain healthy in Canada for future agricultural production. Water, however, and not land, is probably agriculture's critical limiting factor. You can see on this slide areas in light blue are places with little or no water scarcity. Canada is one of those, but look where you've got the dark purple. Those are areas of huge population growth. There are also areas where there isn't a lot of water. Humanity's water use is greater than nature's ability to renew the supply. Agriculture takes about 70% of the water we consume. As a result, water tables around the world are plummeting. The one in Punjab has fallen from a couple of meters below the surface to, in parts, hundreds of meters down. The rivers that water some of the world's breadbaskets, such as the Colorado, the Murray-Darling in Australia, and the Indus, those rivers no longer reach the sea. They're too dry. On 2030, by most estimates, farmers will need 45% more water, and they won't get it. Cities are the second largest users of water, and those in the emerging world, as we've already seen, are growing exponentially. They already account for half the world's population, and it'll be 70% by 2050. In any dispute between cities and farmers, governments are increasingly likely to side with the cities. Agriculture's share of the world's water use used to be 90%. So it's already fallen to 70, and it will surely decline further. The reason that water matters so much is that irrigated farming is so productive. It occupies only 1/5 of the world's farmland, but contributes 2/5 of the world's food output. Water problems will worsen both because irrigated areas will suffer disproportionately from the effect of climate change and because diets are shifting towards meat. Meat is a thirsty food. It takes about 2,000 liters of water to produce a kilo of wheat, but it takes 16,000 liters of water to produce a kilo of beef. As more people eat more meat, rising demand by farmers will collide with contracting water supplies. Let's talk about livestock, including fish. Improving livestock farming, which I include aquaculture here because it's clearly not fishing, but a form of livestock farming. Livestock farming is important because of meat's growing share in the world's diet. Here is a slide about world livestock trends. You can see that on the left, past and projected meat production. You can see the red line, which is the developing world, producing a lot less meat than the developed world until sometime in the mid-90s. And you can see that growth curve just taking off. On the right, it's past and projected milk production, something quite similar happening there, although we haven't quite reached the crossover point yet, but we will very shortly. Meat consumption in China more than doubled between 1980 and 2005 to 50 kilos a person. 50 kilos a person in a population of 1.3 billion. You do the math. Between now and 2050, meat's share of calories in China will rise from 7% to 9%, says the FAO, and the share of dairy produce and eggs will rise even more. Since the 1980s, livestock production has far outstripped that of cereals. World meat output more than doubled between 1980 and 2007. Production of eggs rose even more. You will know as well as I do that we expect aquaculture to be supplying half the fish and seafood protein consumed in the world in a few short years. We're almost there. Much of this increase is due to changes in the way we raise animals. For sheer efficiency, there is little question that industrial approaches to raising livestock do a better job than traditional methods. A free-range hen scratching around might lay 1 or 2 eggs a week. Feeding her costs nothing, giving a net gain of 50 to 80 eggs a year. A battery chicken will lay 6 eggs a week. She might cost the equivalent of 150 eggs to feed, producing an annual net gain of 150 eggs. And selective breeding has made her more economic to keep. Battery chickens used to need 4 kilos of feed for 1 kilo of eggs. They now only need 2 kilos of feed. And I know that developments are similar in aquaculture. Moreover, it is almost impossible to scale up a farmyard operation. There are only so many insects to eat and so many hens one family can look after. And to breed the most productive hens, which convert their feed most efficiently into eggs and are most resistant to disease, you need large flocks. Beyond these advantages, genetic science could improve breeding dramatically. It allows breeders to select traits more precisely and thus speeds up breeding by reducing intergenerational intervals. If you know which genetic traits you're giving to an animal, there's no need to wait several generations to see what the breeding produces. Let me talk for a minute more specifically about aquaculture. According to the FAO, aquaculture is the fastest growing animal food producing sector, with per capita supply from aquaculture increasing at an average annual growth rate of 6.6%. Total global aquaculture production reached 70 million tons in 2009, up more than 600% from 9.9 million tons in 1984. Globally, aquaculture accounted for just under half of the world's fish food production for human consumption in 2008 and should reach 50% sometime this year. Between 1970 and 2008, the production of food fish from aquaculture increased at an average rate of 8.3%, while the world population grew at an average of 1.6% a year. Aquaculture is part of the solution to the problems that we've been talking about. So in the context of our narrative about looming food shortages and the declining ability of the world to feed itself, aquaculture is a good news story. But there's more, which shows aquaculture facing many of the same challenges as other agri-food businesses. Think about Asia, for example, where aquaculture has enjoyed the greatest growth. The Asia-Pacific region accounted for 89% of production. Let's call it 90. 9/10 of all production of aquaculture happened in Asia, the Asia-Pacific region, and 80% of the production in terms of value in 2009. And this dominance is mainly because of China, which accounts for over 60% of global production in terms of quantity. Let's look at what's happening in China. The agricultural intensification I've talked about, the heavy use of fertilizers and so on, has resulted in, for instance, in 2007, China declared that year the year of algae. The year of algae because of repeated outbreaks due to pollution. And if you look at this slide, you can see between China and Korea, the huge amount is visible from space. The amount of fertilizer and erosion that's running off into the sea, and aquaculture is having, because of these conditions, to move to much riskier locations offshore. Canada has both natural and human advantages, offering us an opportunity to become the premier supplier of agriculture and agri-food products to the world. We have the third largest endowment of land, as I've said. Most of Canada's competitors have much less than we do. Another advantage for Canada we've already discussed is the quality and health of our soil. The final natural advantage for Canada is our access to water. We are one of the few nations in the world not to experience food shortage, or water shortages rather. We have about 9% of the world's renewable fresh water supply, and our use of renewable water resources as a percent of total resources is very low compared to our competitors. Canadians may be nervous about exporting water as a commodity, but we indirectly export massive amounts of water very happily, disguised within our agricultural production. In addition to these natural advantages, Canada also possesses two advantages we have created for ourselves through our own efforts. The first is infrastructure. Remember what I said about Kazakhstan. It's got a lot of land, but whatever you grow there, you can't get to anybody. Well, we don't have that problem. In a comparative sense, it's much easier for Canadians to deliver their products to market than many of our potential competitors. And in addition, Canada maintains a recognized scientific and research-based infrastructure to support the industry. And we heard, for instance, from the vet school here at UPI about the marvelous work they're doing there. A shining example of some of the advantages we've created for ourselves. Second advantage we've made for ourselves is our long history and experience with the industry. Agriculture is one of the founding industries of Canada, and we are knowledgeable about the science, the art, and the management of all aspects of the agri-food business. Now, against the dramatic increase in future demand for food we have looked at together here today, Canada stands out as one of the best endowed nations on the face of the earth. Our future prosperity could be intimately tied up with feeding the planet. And yet, Canada is losing market share in every major agri-food product in the world except pulses. The loss in market share is both at the farm level and in food manufacturing. It's just as true of aquaculture as of all the other agri-food products. Underlying the loss in market share is lagging productivity in Canada's agriculture and food sector, and this is true for primary agriculture as well as food processing. I'll give you a few examples here. Here's comparing productivity growth in Canadian versus U.S. primary agriculture. Canada in red, U.S. in yellow. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. Here's comparing feed grain yields, Iowa corn productivity growth in black, Canadian Alberta barley yields in red, corn productivity, Iowa corn in black, Ontario corn in red, Dairy productivity, Canada in blue, leveling off, America about to overtake us. Hog productivity, Canada in blue, America in red. Food processing productivity, value added per dollar of wages and salaries. You can see that the value added in Canada in red is less than $3. In America, it's heading $5. Total food manufacturing, same thing. We have our work cut out for us. Part of the reason for our poor performance is the nature of Canada. Its size and distribution of the relatively small population means that distribution costs are high, and it's difficult to achieve economies of scale. Moreover, we have additional risk because of currency fluctuations. However, there is also considerable evidence that productivity lags because of reasons internal to Canada that have nothing to do with geography or the dollar. Nothing to do with geography or the dollar. Productivity is highly linked with capital investment, as you will know well in the aquaculture industry. Labor productivity rises when workers have automation and when workers work in plants that have economies of scale. In the food manufacturing industry over the past decade, there has been less new investment than capital depreciation. Less new investment than capital depreciation. In other words, we are not merely not investing, we are pulling our money out. We are pulling our money out. It is therefore not surprising that we are not seeing gains in productivity, we are seeing declines. Several factors seem to contribute to Canada's poor performance, and my view is that many of these can be changed through government leadership and reform. Let's talk about the regulatory system. I'm going to talk about agriculture in general, and then I'm going to talk about aquaculture. Let's talk about agriculture first. The regulatory system. And this will sound familiar to you in aquaculture, and this applies completely to you. Canada's regulatory system is slow, cumbersome, and inefficient. Does that sound familiar? It discourages the adoption of new technologies at the farm level and in food processing. Sound familiar? It discourages food companies from developing new products that can provide health and other benefits to consumers. And as a result, it removes the opportunity for farmers and food companies to differentiate their products. It is, in a word, an oppressive blanket on innovation in the food sector that not only discourages investment, but it drives it out of the country. And it removes any opportunity for Canada to be an early adopter of technology in any area of the agri-food business. It should be the subject for immediate and substantial reform aimed at simultaneously providing healthy products to Canadians and encouraging innovation and efficiency in the food supply system. Let's talk about agriculture policy. Canadian governments spend over 70% of their ag budgets on farm income support. When one adds in the economic benefit to the dairy and poultry industries resulting from supply management, price and income support represents roughly 90% of total government agricultural and food policy. In total, according to the OECD, Canada's market support for agriculture remains between about a fifth and a quarter of gross farm income on average, year in, year out. Other countries have transformed their policies either to reduce market support below 10%, as in Australia and New Zealand, or have begun to replace market support with policies aimed at improving productivity and improving the environment. While Canada's market support is nowhere near the highest proportion of total returns amongst OECD countries, the most recent data indicates it's the only country that is not changing its policy. The only country that is not changing its policy. The Canadian economy could benefit from reform to the current income support policies. Canada's agri-food policy, like that of most other developed countries, is a product of 6 decades of food surpluses, low and falling prices, when productivity didn't matter, or when productivity was actively discouraged because it drove people off the land and was politically unpopular. Those circumstances are disappearing. If the more likely prospect is food scarcity in the future, then it is more than time to rethink our policy. you want to know why, here's a slide showing the composition of Canada's agri-food exports to the United States. You can see the little yellow bars at the bottom are bulk agricultural commodities. We hardly export any of them to the United States. The red ones are intermediate products. They're not final consumer products, but they're partially processed. And the green ones are products aimed at the final consumer. Huge share of our exports to the United States is absolutely the reverse of what we're sending to the rest of the world. The rest of the world, you can see the yellow bars are our unprocessed bulk exports, whereas final consumer products are much smaller green bar to the right. So if you think that rising incomes are going to change the patterns of food consumption for people around the world, more in the direction of what Americans are thinking, well, we're not going to get them to the American levels, but we're shifting in that direction. This is where the growth opportunities are. The opportunity is especially great for a country whose agriculture and food productivity relies, as we do, on export markets. And Canadian agriculture and aquaculture would benefit from orderly expansion of export markets in the future. And for that, we need the increased productivity that I've talked about, and for that, we need to change the way that government subsidizes agriculture. Talk about preoccupation with small operations. Both inside agriculture policy and outside, many programs, sometimes with direct government investment, aim to increase the number of small operations. This reduces our competitive advantage and directly and indirectly reduces the amount of capital available for investment. For example, there were 100,000 farms in Canada, 100,000 farms in Canada with sales of less than $100,000 a year, and that represented more than half of all farms in Canada. They generated only 5.7% of net operating income, but collected 16% of support payments from government. These farms had about $4.2 billion in income from other non-farm sources. While a few of them may be legitimate farms, very few of them contribute much to the economy, and they take a huge amount of government resources. Let's talk about international trade policy. Canada suffers from serious tariff and non-tariff barriers in reaching markets that demand Canadian products. In other words, there are markets where consumers demand products made in Canada, but trade barriers stand in our way. Nothing illustrates the importance of market access better than the example shown below of the, which I'm going to talk about, of the Canadian pork industry. Millions of dollars in public funds were invested in a money-losing industry over the past 5 years, an industry that declined about 20%, even as demand for its products was dramatically increasing in the rest of the world. Expanded and secure market access is the solution not only for the pork industry, but for the entirety of the agriculture and agri-food sector. And last but not least, there is aquaculture. The growth of aquaculture in Canada, while steady, has not been as strong as we might expect, given the enormous length of this country's coastline and our world-class expertise in fish farming. In part, aquaculture has grown slowly because historically wild fish were so abundant in Canada's coastal waters. With the depletion of wild fish stocks and Canada's declaration of sovereignty over a 200-mile economic zone, attention has slowly turned to farmed fish as an alternative source of supply. Yet this source of this part of the agri-food industry is just as much hampered by institutional obstacles as pork or dairy or grain. In recent years in particular, the Canadian aquaculture industry has stagnated, with production, as Ruth Salmon mentioned, varying only slightly between 155,000 and 175,000 tons over the last decade. If anything, total production was slightly lower in 2010 and 2011 than in 2000 and 2001. While average annual growth rates in the industry for the rest of the world continue to be 6% or more, Canada's average rate of growth has fallen to less than 1.5%, or 1/4 of growth rates in the rest of the world. So this is another case of Canada failing to live up to the natural and human endowment that we enjoy. Perhaps the most important obstacle to changing the state of affairs in aquaculture is what I like to call an antique system of property rights. that makes little distinction between wild fish that are gathered in the open ocean and those that are farmed. The result is that fish farming is overseen by the same federal government department, Fisheries and Oceans, that also governs the wild fishery, instead of by a department such as Agriculture, where it more properly belongs. As one person put it, the government's oversight of aquaculture is analogous to a chicken farm being managed by the Migratory Birds Act. It also means that bureaucrats within DFO, a department that grew up in relation to the wild fishery, lack a scientific expertise to determine what is best for the aquaculture industry. The second obstacle to the growth of aquaculture is the nature of government in Canada. The minister in charge of the department that oversees aquaculture is, like all politicians, highly motivated by political concerns. I see our politician has left. I can speak more freely now. Particularly the desire to be re-elected. Accordingly, he or she is vulnerable to pressure from special interest groups that do not necessarily, shall I say diplomatically, have the interests of the aquaculture industry at heart, including some conservationists, environmental groups, commercial fishermen, Aboriginal peoples, recreation and tourist interests, and waterfront property owners. Does that list sound familiar? Indeed, such groups may be actively hostile, to fish farming. And the campaigns they wage against it have a damaging effect on aquaculture policy. Again, in this, there is little that separates aquaculture from the rest of the agri-food business. There are parts of the environmental movement, as we know, that are essentially opposed to the use of animals to feed people. And they consider any and all tactics to be permitted in what they consider a moral crusade. Except that the moral crusade that trumps that one by a country mile, in my view, is the one that will be required to maintain, let alone improve, our ability to feed the 9 billion people we will have living on the planet in less than 40 years. That's the moral crusade that we have to carry out. Thus, in the case of aquaculture, no matter what fish farmers do to keep their fish stocks healthy and use responsible methods to increase productivity and reduce the ecological footprint of fish farming, environmental activists point to their use of veterinary drugs or to genetic modification or the presence of minuscule amounts of pollutants to charge that farmed fish are dangerous. The solution to the problems that Canadian aquaculture faces involve 3 strategies. First, establish the same private property rights in aquaculture that exist in agriculture. That means giving fish farmers ownership of the means of production, an exclusive right to the profit gained from the farmer's use of those means. If outright ownership is not possible, the alternative should be to issue leases and licenses for a sufficient length of time to encourage investment in water quality equipment and fish health in general. Second, we have to separate government oversight of aquaculture from that of the wild fisheries. Ideally, this would involve creating a separate, fully independent and competent government agency with its own legislative framework, its own Aquaculture Act, to regulate and support aquaculture. A less comprehensive alternative would be to create an independent unit within the Department of Agriculture. Third, we have to replace politicized decision-making with objective cost-benefit analysis in disputes concerning aquaculture. Bureaucrats and politicians, under pressure from environmental activists, apply the precautionary principle to the point of paralyzing decision-making within DFO. Instead, an institutionalized, economics-based process, independent of any competing special interest, has to objectively analyze and inform both the bureaucracy and the courts about the development effects of their decisions with respect to fish farming. If we were to achieve all of this, or even just a major part of it, of this ambitious program that I have laid out for you today, ladies and gentlemen, Canada would be well on its way to being the major food superpower we are entirely capable of being. And we will be making a disproportionate contribution to solving the urgent conundrum of how to keep mass hunger from stalking humanity. Thank you.